tonight's semi-final debate. My name is Max Briggs and I'm the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Matilda Brathwaite. Is that correct?
That's it. Right.
This debate will be judged by a panel of 3 adjudicators who are Mr. Lolan, Mr. Huey, and Mr. Hemsley. The topic of this debate is that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Pembroke School, and the negative team seated to my left is from St. Peter's Girls. The speaking time for this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will ring, will sound at the speaking time. We're going to do an example. Semi-finals, I'm sure we know what we're doing. I declare this debate open, and I call upon the first affirmative speaker, Tom Say.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech, and we, the affirmative team, hold this statement to be true. We define Charlie Hebdo as the French satirical magazine, which is published weekly and often features satirical cartoons. The act of them republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad refers to the plan proposed by the editor of Charlie Hebdo to republish and recirculate cartoons first published in 2012, depicting the Islamic religious leader, the Prophet Muhammad. This republishing comes in response to the legal trial of the perpetrators of the 2015 terrorist attack on the magazine, which is currently taking place. We define commitment as the dedication and support that may be continued by the republishing of these cartoons. Freedom of speech refers to the values in which everyone has the right to express and vocalize their opinions. In this context, especially the values of these within the French culture. This is enshrined in the French Constitution, specifically Article 11, which states, "The free communication of ideas and of opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Any citizen may therefore speak, write, and publish freely, except what is tantamount to the abuse of this liberty." Note that this is very similar to the freedom of the press. As these cartoons have not been taken to a court of law in France, and thus have not been deemed illegal, this definition is contextually relevant within the scope of this debate. So therefore, the topic is that Charlie Hebdo republishing cartoons of from 2012 featuring caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad in accordance to the editor's statements demonstrates the dedication and support of the French ideals of freedom of speech. Okay, thanks for hanging in there, everyone. Today as first speaker, I'll confirm that the act of republishing the cartoons is an act of free speech. I'll first talk about why the cartoons constitute an act of free speech, before moving on to discuss how the French cultural climate is also important to consider, and how these freedoms are especially important to the French. Our second speaker will take this further to illustrate the commitment Hebdo makes when republishing. He will be talking about how even in the face of adversity, Charlie Hebdo is committed to free speech and is still republishing. He'll also talk to you about how the magazine has become a symbol of freedom of the press, and how this republishing extends this commitment. And our third team speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. So first of all, how does the republishing of these cartoons constitute an act of free speech? Well, Charlie Hebdo and the cartoons it produces have become important focus points when discussing free speech, as well as freedom of the press. In countries like France, or here in Australia, freedom of speech is considered the right to express any opinions without censorship or fear of unjust repercussions. This can be considered in society, where groups of people believe in and together attempt to guarantee freedom of speech, but it is also protected by law to ensure equality between groups and opinions. Because of the problems that arise when comparing absolute free speech to the subjective matter of what offends people and how that could limit free speech, the current orthodox philosophical view, supported by ethicist Simon Longstaff and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is that free speech should be limited only when it endangers or dehumanizes people. This includes inciting violence, supporting terrorism, or calling for other groups or individuals to be stripped of their human rights. These ideas are also consistent within our legal systems. In France, the relevant legal system for this debate, government intervention only occurs in these instances, and only when individuals are involved. So how do these laws and moral guidelines compare to the republishing of the controversial cartoons? While offensive to some members of the Muslim community, the cartoons do none of these things that will constitute hate speech. They do not incite violence in any way and are by no means dehumanizing, definitely not calling for rights to be stripped away from others. They're largely satirical and meant to be humorous. In addition to this, the cartoon's message does not target individual people and is instead largely directed at organizations. For example, some of the cartoons protested the introduction of Sharia law in Libya and elsewhere. Republishing these cartoons is therefore an act of free speech, which also has greater significance to a commitment to these ideals, which our second speaker will talk about. For my second point, I'd like to examine the French context in which this is happening, which will further prove how freedom of speech applies to these cartoons, and while also introducing how they constitute a commitment to this freedom of speech, especially in France. In France, freedom of speech is very important and is considered an essential freedom protected by the French Constitution. This freedom of speech is often considered to be even more enshrined than other countries because of the long history of censorship within France. When it was finally protected by the French Third Republic in 1881, it was considered a fundamental right. Another important concept which overlaps with this is freedom of religion and secularism. Something I think we cannot underestimate in this debate is how important the concept of secularism or separation of religion and the government is. This is known as laïcité in France and was put in place during the French Revolution to guarantee freedom of religion. This concept is often cited as so important in France that, according to the French government itself, protecting this concept comes above individuality and personal freedoms, which is slightly ironic. Hebdo is an important part of this, proclaiming themselves to be highly secular and believes that religious organizations should be allowed to be criticized to preserve these ideals. By using examples of religious extremism and republishing these controversial cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad despite the opposition they've received, Hebdo's actions embody the ongoing commitment to keeping France independent and free by commenting on such religious matters which are important to the independence of the state, enshrined in the principles of laïcité. Republishing the cartoons is the next important step they will take to commit to and secure the nation's free speech or freedom of religion. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, these cartoons are protected by free speech, and republishing them is important to continue the commitment that not only Charlie Hebdo has to these freedoms, but the entire country of France. Thank you.
I now call upon the first negative speaker, Stella Clare.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech. As the negative team, we disagree with this statement and believe that by republishing the cartoons, Charlie Hebdo has undermined the concept of free speech by deliberately imposing a derogatory view which has deeply offended the Muslim community. Before I begin, I would like to point out some flaws in the affirmative's case. The affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that free speech is important to French culture. However, we ask you, how important are France's Muslims to their culture? Because in republishing their cartoons as a supposed act of free speech, Charlie Hebdo has ridiculed Muslim leader Muhammad, which is a direct contradiction of free speech restrictions, which aim to protect religious beliefs, and I will discuss this further in my debate. The affirmative speaker has also stated that free speech is a fundamental right. However, we would like to point out that there also exists a right to anti-discrimination, which protects people's religions, among other things. Before I begin, I would like to emphasise the fact that by condemning Charlie Hebdo's actions, we are not belittling the events of January 2015. The first point I will argue is that Charlie Hebdo's republishing of their cartoons can't be a commitment of free speech because their initial publishing of them wasn't an expression of free speech. I will then argue that the magazine itself has not provided reason for the public to believe that they're committing to free speech. In fact, they have instead vowed to never make another offensive mistake with their cartoons. They've also suggested that their republishing of the cartoons was done solely for legal purposes and not because they necessarily stand by their actions in 2015. Our second speaker, Abby, will then discuss the fact that Charlie Hebdo's republishing of the cartoons is not a commitment to free speech, but rather an attempt to boost financial sales in light of the trial. She will then point out that if Charlie Hebdo really was committed to free speech, then they would have continued to produce similar pieces, perhaps about different religions or other ambiguous topics. Now I will argue my first point, that Charlie Hebdo has not practiced their right to free speech. Instead, they have undermined this right by allowing the public to believe that free speech can justify blasphemy. Free speech combines the concept of free speech itself with the simple act of respecting others. Barack Obama has promoted this same idea, saying that free speech should be used as a tool to, quote, voice tolerance and encourage values of understanding and mutual respect. To appeal to these values, it's necessary that all members of society, including news platforms, demonstrate respect when they express an opinion, to ensure that freedom of expression doesn't become a tool to provoke violence. It's for this exact reason that the European Commission of Human Rights places an emphasis on practicing free speech within the restraints of society. The Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs argues a similar point, saying that the many restrictions placed upon free speech are necessary to maintain societal harmony. The existing restrictions around free speech include anti-discrimination laws as well as other commitments that are founded on the assumption that people are willing to respect others and tolerate all religions, races and genders. Evidently, Charlie Hebdo has failed to uphold their responsibility as a news platform and as a member of society to respect other religions when they share opinion pieces. In publishing and republishing their cartoons, Charlie Hebdo has discriminated against and offended a minority by portraying their religious leader as a suicide bomber in a supposedly comical way. As a result, they have not only disrupted societal harmony, but they have also led many French Muslims to believe that Charlie Hebdo is, quote, Islamophobic. Their supposed expressions of free speech have therefore made an already marginalised minority feel targeted. In doing so, they have directly undermined the existing restrictions on free speech which aim to promote this mutual respect. Our team believes that their cartoons should therefore not be considered an expression of free speech at all, and the fact that so many people still consider the cartoons to be a display of free speech is even more offensive to the people targeted by these cartoons. This is because it belittles the response of the Muslim community who were offended by the cartoons because it suggests to them that their response had no grounds if Charlie's actions were simply a display of free speech. The fact is, a religion was targeted and deeply offended by the actions of Charlie Hebdo, and so we, the negative team, see no point in trying to justify something that could generate this kind of response. And since we cannot defend free speech by curtailing how that free speech was received, we argue that the initial publication of the cartoons cannot be regarded as an expression of free speech. Therefore, their republishing of the cartoons is most definitely not a commitment to it. Now I'll move on to my second point, that Charlie Hebdo has not said enough for us to believe that they're committing to free speech, and that we should therefore have no reason to believe that they are. The magazine itself has openly explained why they want to republish the cartoons, and in no way have they claimed that it's because they want to commit to free speech. According to editors at Charlie Hebdo, the magazine believes that it was, quote, unacceptable to start the new trial without showing the relevant pieces of evidence, specifically the cartoons. Feeling obligated to publish something does not indicate that they stand by publishing it. Instead, they have merely felt it, quote, essential to publish them for the sake of public knowledge. They also said that they republished the cartoons out of fear of displaying, quote, political and journalistic cowardice. Clearly, this is not an attitude that would suggest they support their past action. Rather, it tells us that they have no choice but to defend their actions or otherwise display what they believe is cowardice. If you read their website, you'll also learn that Charlie Hebdo has tried to play the cartoons off as, quote, exhibits, saying that they're a part of history now. This provides even less reason for us to believe that their republishing of the cartoons is a commitment to free speech. In fact, according to their own editors, whenever the public asks them to release other caricature of Muhammad, they always refuse to do so because there is, quote, no good reason to do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we argue is that Charlie Hebdo's actions have in no way demonstrated a commitment to free speech. Instead, their actions have shown the public that clearly there is a fine line between expressing an opinion for the purpose of free speech and expressing it for the purpose of being satirical. Charlie Hebdo's satire has therefore provided society with the opportunity to reflect on how we can preserve free speech and prevent it from becoming a tool to ridicule others. Thank you.
I now call upon the second affirmative speaker, Dylan Warswick.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, timekeeper and chairman. The topic for this evening's debate is that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech, and we, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. Our first speaker has already spoken to you about how the socio-political climate in France means that it's imperative that these cartoons be republished to show commitment to free speech. He also noted how this republication constituted a strong commitment to free speech in the first place. Today, as second speaker, I will illustrate the immense investment by Charlie Hebdo to upholding free speech and the symbolic nature of Charlie Hebdo as an ambassador for free speech. Before commencing, I'll illustrate some flaws in the opposition's case. The opposition has stated that these comments are incredibly derogatory. This is false, as there is no universal interpretation of what it means to be derogatory and rude. She also likened this and cited this blasphemy. Blasphemy is actually legal in France, as reiterated by Emmanuel Macron, who said he would thoroughly defend these rights. She also stated that there's no reason to believe that this is indeed a sincere act. This is also false, as I'll later explain, the appalling reality of life and pain faced means this is a sincere event. It's also important to recognise the gravitas of these terrorist attacks and how this impacts the life of the people at Hebdo's offices. Furthermore, the symbolic nature of Hebdo as an ambassador for free speech means this merely contextually supports free speech. Now to my first point, on the financial and emotional investment of Charlie Hebdo in the republication of these cartoons. Republishing these cartoons requires immense courage and dedication to the free speech movement. Laurent Lee Solisset, the magazine's editor, said that threats and hate mail have never really stopped after the January 2015 attack. In spite of this, Charlie Hebdo has not only continued publishing, but will republish the very article that caused the death of their colleagues. It is this commitment to publication and free speech that illustrates why republication is so profound. According to Michael Morell, former CIA deputy director, the motives for these attacks were absolutely clear: trying to shut down a media organisation that lampooned the Prophet Muhammad. These terrorists sought to silence the press freedom and freedom of speech exercised by Charlie Hebdo. Deceased editor Stéphane Charbonnier said, "If we were worried about the consequences of each of our drawings in each of our 1,057 issues, then we would have had to close shop a long time ago." This spirit very much remains alive at Charlie Hebdo. Facing widespread opposition for their inflammatory statements, their unrelenting dedication to upholding freedom of speech has come to characterise the organisation. Their dedication to publishing and republishing the article which crystallises their expression of free speech illustrates why Charlie Hebdo is so important in preserving free speech. Whenever Charlie Hebdo publishes something like this, which is controversial, there are peaks where we receive explicit death threats on social media. It is self-evidently not in the interest of writers to republish this, but the importance of preserving free speech is valued more highly by the writers and the paper as a whole. Republishing this material means reliving the pain of the attack for many, with one stating, "I'm afraid in the panic room because I'm claustrophobic. I'm afraid because I'm convinced I'll hear the click-clash of Kalashnikovs again one day." Charlie Hebdo is sufficiently dedicated to confronting those who wish to silence free speech that they relive unimaginable emotional pain, live in secrecy like illegal aliens. This dedication to retaliating against those who suppress free speech has come to embody the spirit of Charlie Hebdo. The cost of publishing this material and exercising free speech extends even to family members of the writers, illustrating the cost they are willing to bear. An article from The World noted that family members are no longer able to attend public events for fear of personal safety, illustrating the consequences on their families. This also goes to the massive financial investment, with €1.5 million in security expenses, personal security guards, bunker-style building, panic room and bodyguards to protect their workers. Clearly, an immense financial burden rests on the company, making their publication difficult. Publisher Rhys Soyce went on to add, "This vital freedom expression in France is becoming a luxury. Only the wealthy media will be able to enjoy." Despite this, Charlie Hebdo has continued to republish their cartoons as a means to express their free ideas. Now to my second point, that Charlie Hebdo has become a freedom of speech ambassador, and that publishing these cartoons illustrates commitment to this movement as a whole. Immediately following the terrorist attack, massive rallies throughout France were held, with over 3.7 million in attendance under the Je suis Charlie movement. They attended to support free speech and the victims. This slogan has become synonymous with freedom of speech movement in France and highlights how this serves an ongoing commitment to freedom of speech. The New York Times noted how Je suis Charlie became a slogan used even by people who disdained the magazine as a way not only to express support for victims, but also free speech and free press. Charlie Hebdo has become more than a press agency, but an ambassador and representative of free speech in France. Not publishing these cartoons, especially after the publication being announced, would serve to undermine the whole Je suis Charlie movement and its push for freedom of speech. Republishing this cartoon is more than an inflammatory retaliation against terrorists. It is a movement centered around promoting Je suis Charlie and free speech. The profound effect of Je suis Charlie prompted Mohamed Moussaoui, president of the French Council of the Muslim Faith, to state, "The freedom of caricature is guaranteed for everyone. Nothing can justify violence." Clearly, republication is about far more than gaining media attention. It holds a deeply symbolic value, which stands in stark contrast to all the adversity that Charlie Hebdo has faced. This symbolism of freedom of speech illustrates how committed Charlie Hebdo is to upholding this freedom of speech right exercised by Parisians. The French president recently went on record saying, "The freedom to blaspheme in France went hand in hand with the freedom of conscience. And I am here to protect all of those freedoms." Irrespective of the motives, the republication of these cartoons has had an undeniable systemic effect on the freedom of speech movement, both in France and throughout the globe. An interview with Radio France on the eve of the 5th anniversary of the attack just this year noted how Hebdo sounded an international call for states to protect journalists from religious intolerance. Charlie Hebdo has had a positive international impact on the freedom of speech movement. Charlie Hebdo has become more than simply a press agency. The inflammatory nature of their material and larger social influence shows how Charlie Hebdo has come to embody free speech and a defiance of those who wish to silence the press. Clearly, republishing the article that caused the greatest assault on freedom of speech, symbolises Charlie Hebdo's commitment to upholding free speech and the immense value of Charlie Hebdo as a global free speech advocate. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, Charlie Hebdo has shown immense commitment to expressing their free speech. The immense personal, social, familial and economic burden carried by the company and its writers illustrates how committed the writers are to upholding their right to freedom of speech. The intense and daily hardship they endure, which enables this republication, illustrates the ongoing commitment of Charlie Hebdo to the free speech movement. While it'd be far easier not to republish, this valiant effort to republish the cartoon shows the will of Charlie Hebdo to uphold free speech. Thus, in order for this commitment to be reiterated and for the symbolic value of Charlie Hebdo to be upheld, it's imperative these cartoons are republished.
now call upon the second negative speaker, Abby Lyle.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I'll be discussing how the republication of these cartoons by Charlie Hebdo may be for financial gain, and if the magazine was truly committed to freedom of speech, they would have ridiculed other challenging organisations in the past 5 years. But first, some flaws in the opposition's debate. The affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that Charlie Hebdo is a symbolic ambassador for free speech. We completely agree. They're a news platform. They practice free speech all the time, and they would be the perfect ambassador had they not ridiculed a religion in 2015. When they did this, they crossed a line over to committing blasphemy and discriminating a religion, which directly undermines the fundamental right to anti-discrimination. In opposing this debate, it must be clearly understood that we are not belittling the horror of the event of January 2015. Free speech has almost become somewhat sacred, certainly in the time after the Charlie Hebdo killings. So I'd like to think this debate doesn't become a pro-free speech versus anti-free speech debate. It's more complex and nuanced than that. In continuing our team's rejection of this motion that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech, the question needs to be asked, why now? In an interview for French TV, the editorial team of Charlie Hebdo stated, "We have often been asked since January 2015 to print other caricatures of Muhammad. It said we've always refused to do so, not because it's prohibited, the law allows us to do so, but because there was a need for a good reason to do it, a reason which has meaning and which brings something to the conversation." They continue to state that we have given up the right to publish these cartoons. That would mean that we were wrong to do so in the first place. So what is this good reason Charlie Hebdo believes that made it necessary to republish these cartoons? It is clear that the reason the publishments are occurring now is to coincide with the trial of the 14 alleged attackers responsible for the attack of the Charlie Hebdo offices 5 years ago, and the ensuing attacks over the following days. A cynic might argue there is therefore a commercial angle to this. Before 2015, about 40,000 people read Charlie Hebdo each week. Shortly after the attack, they printed 3 million copies for street sale, and the magazine numbers of subscribers rose to 260,000. And 6 months following, it was selling 120,000 copies each week. However, by 2018, it only had 35,000 subscribers and sold a further 35,000 to non-subscribers. After a further decline in sales, it marked the 4th anniversary of the attacks in 2019 with an editorial that asked the readers, "Are you still there?" Given those numbers and the current rampant interest in France surrounding the trial, surely it could be argued that there is nothing more than a publicity stunt, a cold-blooded and distasteful piece of opportunism seeking the result increase in magazine circulation. Far from adding something to the debate, as the editors would have you believe, an economy ravaged by the effects of COVID-19 in a way France hasn't seen, this is a deliberate ploy to leverage economic gain from the situation. For my second point, if they were truly committed to free speech, they would have poked, ridiculed, and offended at many more challenging organisations in the past 5 years. Back in 2015, the initial publication of the cartoons that sparked the horrific acts for which 14 people now stand trial, the publication had been subject to threats and fury for the better part of a decade, particularly in 2006 when the magazine reproduced Danish cartoons of Muhammad, which had already created a great storm around the world. Such depictions are, of course, blasphemy to most Muslims, but far from relenting, the editors played double or nothing, going on to produce such provocations as a special issue guest edited by the Prophet. To the devout, including very many that are peaceful and loving, all this was deeply offensive, and in a way had the intention, satire, to shock. Defenders of such an approach would argue that being shocking is going to involve offending someone. They would say that if there is a right to free speech, there has to be a right to offend. And society that is serious about liberty has to defend the free flow of ugly words, even ugly sentiments. But here's the point of conflict. The satirism of Charlie Hebdo is a product of a reflective of dominant liberal French culture that says religion or race has no role to play in French society and the greater good of France, according to French L'Express. French radicals have commonly mocked Christianity, just as Charlie Hebdo did, and they have never seen any reason not to do so, to the same to other faiths. Such secularism goes hand in hand with other French acts, like banning the full-face veil. As Ilan Horno from the news website Spiked wrote, free speech is the right to one's ideas without fear of retribution, even if others disagree with you, even if they are repulsed. This right leaves people free to discern and free to persuade others of their ideas. No political, religious, or ideological viewpoint should be allowed a special exemption from challenge, criticism, or ridicule. Let's look at the key words in that statement. No political, religious, or ideological viewpoint should be free from challenge, criticism, or ridicule. However, in a world where Pakistan minorities are protesting in the United Kingdom, or the citizenship protests sparking throughout India, Charlie Hebdo has remained silent. Perhaps because some things are too raw, too immediate, too sacred to satirise. Having danced an already fine line between satire and racism with regard to their mockery of Islam, perhaps they realise that politically correct self-censorship that has much of Western culture tying itself in knots would be too far. For example, it could be about condemning the press for their detailed coverage of the aftermath of the original attack on the offices of Charlie Hebdo and the ensuing Je suis Charlie movement, whilst ignoring the massacres of over 2,000 Nigerians that were killed during a highly organised and coordinated terrorist attack by Boko Haram in the same week. Free speech could have been used to satirise the involvement of heads of state present at the original Je suis Charlie marches, who themselves has questionable human rights records. The international non-profit organisation Reporters Without Borders was particularly critical of figures such as Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, who all carry Je suis Charlie banners, but who have long been accused of restricting the freedom of speech in their own countries. Instead, this republication is not committed to or a plea for freedom of speech. It just shot in the battle to be allowed to freely offend with no consequence, and to do so in a politically biased and carefully orchestrated and mindful way. It is questionable whether the team at Charlie Hebdo are really showing a commitment to free speech in all its forms and with all its dangers. There is no doubt they publish these cartoons at a considerable risk to themselves, given the threats already issued by Al-Qaeda and the high level of security surrounding each publication. However, with republication, it's arguable that they are merely repeating an attack on a religion belittled by a violently aggressive extremist minority, but largely characterising by a peace-loving, moderate and accepted silent majority. In fact, you can argue that they're repeating an attack on a peaceful target while knowing they're likely to offend the very same people who may have caused the first attack. A commitment to speech should be so much more than that. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the negative team believe that the statement that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech to be false. Thank you.
I now call upon the third affirmative speaker, Jasper Dew.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech. We, the affirmative team, believe that this statement is unquestionably true. Now, before I get to my team summary, I would like to point out a few flaws in the opposition's case. The first negative speaker has claimed that Charlie Hebdo violates free speech and constitutes as hate speech instead. This is simply incorrect, as we have stated in our definition. The free speech laws of France aim to protect, they have stated that the free speech laws aim to protect religion, and this is simply not true in the context of France. As stated in our definition, taken from the French Constitution, The freedom of speech is enshrined in the French Constitution, specifically Article 11, which states the free communication of ideas and of opinions is one of the most precious rights to man. Any citizen, therefore, may speak, write, and publish freely, except when it is tantamount to the abuse of this liberty. The negative team has also considered they have not considered the founding French principle of laïcité, which separates state matters from the church. In the French context, as this debate focuses on, there is very, very, very little protection of or favoritism of religion from the French government, as according to the principles of laïcité. Furthermore, she claimed that Charlie Hebdo targeted the Muslim community through satire. However, firstly, satire is meant to rouse people, get them thinking and talking and questioning aspects of life. It is healthy for a good democracy, and by this very nature is provoking to some people. But this magazine does not specifically target Muslims or Islam. They deal with a variety of other topics and religions, French politics and Christianity, drawing numerous caricatures of the Pope and other religious figures, representing Charlie Hebdo's commitment to free speech in all areas. Publishing such cartoons is not a targeted religious attack. She also tried to explain that they have not said enough to be considered a commitment to free speech, and the magazine has simply published it because it would be journal cowardice not to do so. This is false because they have also, Charlie Hebdo's also stated, which the negative team has admitted, that all the reasons that would be opposed to us relate only to political or journalistic cowardice. Do we want to live in a country that prides itself on being a great, free and modern democracy, and which, at the same time, gives up on asserting its deepest convictions? For our part, not republishing this is out of the question. From an editorial explaining the decision to republish. She also claimed that their acts constitute as blasphemy and not free speech. However, alongside also not defining what blasphemy specifically means, there is no agreement within mainstream Islam over what constitutes blasphemy, what the response to it should be, or how it should fit within the context of freedom of speech, according to Dalia Mahagid, Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Additionally, the Court of Law in France quashed a 2007 case where the Grand Mosque and the Union of Islamic Organizations in France sued Charlie Hebdo on the basis of blasphemy and racism. This case was not successful. The cartoons are therefore considered a part of free speech under French law. She also noted that this is offensive. This is false, as there will always be people who will always be offended in the context of satire, and by not breaching laws, they have not violated our definition of free speech, which still stands. She also said that they were inactive on some issues like the rallies in India. This is false, as they have made comments on many international issues, including some in Nigeria and Syria, as our first speaker mentioned. The second affirmative speaker has also stated that Charlie Hebdo all this was an attempt to boost financial sales. This is incorrect because, and she also asked, why now? Why do it now? Well, the reason that they should do it now is that it is the 5th anniversary of the case, as they have stated. But linking it to this attack is the very reason why this republishing is an act of free speech and not just a ploy to get increased revenues. It is a connection to the backlash that Charlie Hebdo last received when they published these articles, as my second speaker stated. She also mentioned the high levels of security and threats from Al-Qaeda, which further supports the fact that this is an act of free speech. How can, in her words, it be more of a commitment to free speech, be any more than risking the livelihoods of the workers at Hebdo to continue to speak and criticize satirically and freely? Additionally, the magazine has actually lost money since the last attacks. As outlined by my second speaker, this emotional pain they face cannot be done for profit. Buildings were ravaged, cartoonists killed. They all cost money to replace and to fix. And also, even if they did have increased sales, revenues, or attention, this incidental event does not indicate that it is the only motive was profit. Correlation does not equal causation. She also stated that they would have continued to produce they should have been continuing to produce other cartoons of other religions. This is simply false because we have There has been evidence over the past that they are not specifically targeting Muslims. Also publishing articles on politics and Christianity, to name a few. They also cited a definition of free speech from an outside source, which was not included in our definition, and as our definition was not challenged and still stands, this definition of free speech is not contextually appropriate to this debate. Our first speaker outlined how the act of republishing these cartoons is one of free speech through exploring what does and does not constitute free speech under French law, and how the actions of Charlie Hebdo cannot be compared to hate speech through these laws and moral guidelines. Within this, he also delved into the roots of the French Constitution to unearth how free speech is enshrined in the very way of French life, through the principles of laïcité or secularism. This explains how the secular Charlie Hebdo upholds such fundamental French values through publishing such cartoons and reinforcing free speech and laïcité. Our second speaker explained to you how Hebdo establishes a commitment to free speech by doing so in the face of adversity, opposition, and the horrific attack in the magazine in 2015, which killed several people. By drawing on these historic horrors and the emotional and financial crises these attacks caused, our second speaker has also outlined how publishing it was not in the self-interest of the writers, but for the importance of preserving free speech, valued more highly by the paper as a whole. He exemplified this with the Je suis Charlie movement, which has become a powerful freedom of speech movement internationally, undoubtedly linking the republication of these cartoons to the freedom of speech movement. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we the affirmative team undeniably believe that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech. Nous ne pouvons pas perdre ce droit essentiel. We cannot lose this essential human right. Thank you.
Now call upon the third negative speaker, Emily Downey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you are well informed by this stage of the night, the topic for tonight's debate is that Charlie Hebdo republishing the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad is a commitment to free speech, a topic which we, the negative team, agree with. Affirmative. So within this point, the first affirmative speaker has discussed how under French laws republishing their cartoons, Charlie Hebdo is committing to free speech. They've also stated that hate speech that infringes on free speech in France is speech that is dehumanising, pro-terrorism or directed at an individual. Within this point, and while Charlie Hebdo's cartoon is not pro-terrorism, it is arguably dehumanising and more so offensive towards Muslim communities because it is portraying them as inhumane people and offending their religion, which should be offending and belittling their religion, which should surely make it qualify as hate speech. Within this point, they've also argued that Charlie Hebdo's cartoons are humorous and therefore not hate speech. This is drastically incorrect, and there is nothing humorous or funny about their cartoon, which has clearly offended Muslim communities, and as explained by our first speaker. And it also fuels a Western anti-Muslim view. Their cartoon is also incorrect and portrays only an extremist group of Muslims, not the religion as a whole. So when the first negative speaker says that free speech of this form that criticises other religions is important in a secular society, they are not understanding that Charlie Hebdo's cartoon is not a fair criticism of the majority of the people who believe in who have Muslim faith. The first affirmative speaker has also stressed the importance of free speech in France. If free speech is so important in France, why are there such double standards relating to it? Where criticism against Jews or jokes about the Holocaust would be immediately deemed illegal or hate speech, but anti-Muslim and offensive hate speech such as Charlie Hebdo's cartoons are considered free speech. The second affirmative speaker's first point was about how the lengths and sacrifices made by the cartoonist proves that their republishing of this cartoon is a commitment to free speech. However, it is debatable whether their efforts in order to republish this cartoon is a direct result of them trying to promote free speech. Why could it not be inspired instead by further hate for the Muslim community or retaliation against the terrorist attack, which would make the republishing of the cartoon a vengeful and hate-filled action designed to cause offence? If they were really standing for free speech, why is their cartoon directly affecting this particular group? Additionally, the second affirmative speaker claims that Charlie Hebdo has become a symbol of free speech. However, it is still questionable whether it is true free speech that the cartoon is standing for, or if the Charlie Hebdo magazine and even the supporting citizens are incorrect in their understanding of free speech and unclear of the line between hate speech and free speech. True free speech is intended to protect the citizens, not lead to discrimination and division of groups in society. The importance of free speech is to create open dialogue where people are allowed to criticise and respond to others' opinions. Where Charlie Hebdo criticises another religion, they do not allow the response and do not understand the feelings of the group that they've offended, or make any effort to apologise and instead stand by their offensive comments, which is dividing communities instead of bringing them together and allowing understanding, which should really be the true intent behind free speech. Furthermore, the argument that the affirmative team has made relies on the fact that the terrorist attack was a violation of free speech, and in republishing, they are opposing this terrorist group's violation of their free speech. However, it's not proved if the intentions behind the terrorists was to deny free speech. Instead, could they not be motivated by them wanting to protect their own religion, without inferring that their response was justified? The second affirmative speaker has dedicated a lot of their speech to boasting Charlie Hebdo's global reach. We appreciate you doing that because we would like to point out that their significant influence only highlights how damaging their actions were. Their cartoons reach people all over France, including the Muslim community, who they so blatantly ridiculed in 2015. We would assume that such a large news organisation would take more care in appealing to their audience, but apparently not. The third affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that satire is healthy in a society and that it is intended to inspire conversation. We agree, however, Charlie's actions provoked a deadly attack, and so we need to question whether or not their cartoons were in fact satirical or just plain offensive. Additionally, it hasn't inspired much of a conversation surrounding the nature of the Muslim religion, but has instead chosen to fuel an anti-Muslim view that is held by many and causes many negative impacts in society. So to summarise, our first speaker, Stella, has explained what actually constitutes as free speech and how Charlie Hebdo's cartoons was not a commitment to free speech, but instead a form of hate speech. Then tonight, our second speaker discussed how the republication of these cartoons may be for financial gain instead of a commitment to free speech. She also discussed how if the magazine was truly committed to free speech, they would have ridiculed other organisations over the past 5 years. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, free speech is about creating an open and comfortable dialogue in which people can share opinions and receive other people's insights. Free speech is meant to allow us to share our ideas with the intention of better understanding everyone's viewpoint, and it never was intended to divide us, as Charlie Hebdo's cartoon has done. Because of this, we believe that republishing a cartoon that has caused such controversy and offence is not a commitment to free speech. Thank you.
I now invite the representative of the adjudication panel to come forward to announce the result.
As is our custom, we don't give a feedback session, we just nominate who had won. It was a split decision, but it was awarded to the affirmative team, so congratulations. And the debating award goes to Jasper. Congratulations.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team to give a vote of thanks.
Of course, we'd like to start by saying thank you to the opposing team for a great debate. You guys did really well. And for the adjudicators, obviously you didn't give feedback tonight, but obviously you put a lot of thought into tonight. Matilda for coming out and timing. Chairperson's doing a great job. Pembroke parents for supporting your kids. And our collective mother, Miss Alderson. Yeah, Miss Alderson. And our children who did a great job in year 12 and everything in debating this season. So, yeah, thank you.
Now call upon a member of the winning team to give a second that vote of thanks.
Well, yep, thank you again to the adjudicators, I guess most of all for coming out and spending your time watching this great debate. Thank you to the chairman and the timekeeper and the parents for coming out and supporting us. And of course the opposition for an amazing debate. And thank you to everyone for driving out to Nazareth to come and have the debate here. So thank you.
Alright, debate's closed.